Even as we settle in, I'll do a sort of a quick introduction, although the cliche, they need no introduction, is we're really blessed with our panel of experts. All of them are extremely well renowned in the field of human rights in North Korea. They're all incredibly prolific in writing articles exposing the horrors of North Korea, as well as being passionate advocates on behalf of the oppressed. We'd be here all afternoon if I tried to do full honor to their resumes and their awards. Roberta Cohen is a specialist in human rights, humanitarian and refugee issues, a leading expert on the subject of internally displaced persons and human rights conditions in North Korea. Many-hatted, not only non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, but a co-chair of the Committee of Human Rights in North Korea, co-chair of the committee, or adjunct professor at the Academy on Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at AU, author of many articles and books, World Food Day, The Challenge in North Korea, Human Rights in North Korea, China's Forced Repatriation of North Korean Refugees, etc. Jared Genser is a managing director, also multi-hatted, a managing director of Perseus Strategies, founder of Freedom Now, and also an associate at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. I found out he's been referred to often in the media as the extractor, a leading human rights lawyer who gets people out. It sounds like a Schwarzenegger movie.
Not to be confused with your local dentist.
Right. I sort of had the image of Jared, running through the jungle yelling, "Get to the chopper!" But he served as the International Counsel for Burmese democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi during her captivity. He now currently represents the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize laureate Lo Xiaobiao, and op-ed this week in the Washington Post, and I understand you have an event at the National Press Center this week for the imprisoned former Maldiv's president. And Lee Seong-min is the Kim-Kyu Korea Foundation Professor in Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts. He launched the Harvard's Korea Institute series, the Kim-Kyu Forum on U.S.-Korea Relations. Very prolific on authoring many articles. I'm particularly jealous of his ability to get in many of the major U.S. newspapers. And anyone who's heard him debate someone knows that he wields his wit and his eloquence like a rapier, and you do not want to be on the other end of trying to debate Young-sun. So actually, we're going to go kind of in reverse order here. So Seong-min, if you'll lead us off.
Can I speak from the podium?
Yeah, please. And all of us, if you want to speak from the podium or your chair, any is fine.
Thank you very much. Were I to say to you today, as President Obama and Prime Minister Abe celebrate the past 70 years of peace, the special bilateral alliance, that future historians will see the post-1945 rise of industrial East Asia as a remarkable phenomenon in world history, unmatched in the speed with which this materialized and also the scale of the impact. Were I to say to you, I think all of you will agree. Were I to say to you that in this remarkable story, the political construct known as the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is a gross aberration to the story of accretion of wealth and political liberalization, perhaps a mere curious footnote to history or a major case study in Great Leap Backward, I think most of you will still agree. But were I to say to you that the reasons, the causes of the sustained decline of the DPRK and the eventual demise of the DPRK, whenever that happens, were all too evident. In this fact alone, you might be intrigued, but still a bit skeptical. What is the fact? This. Throughout the past 70 years, since the onset of communism in North Korea, basic freedoms in North Korea, for the vast majority of North Koreans, basic freedoms like freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, speech, thought, religion, press, ownership of private property, all these basic freedoms for the vast majority of North Koreans were more circumscribed, more severely restricted than for the majority of individuals living in the Korean peninsula since the onset of the 20th century. That was a very long-winded sentence. Let me try that again. Basic freedoms in North Korea over the past 70 years have been more severely restricted, repressed, than basic freedoms that Koreans have enjoyed throughout the Korean peninsula since the 20th century. When Marcus Noland and Steph Haggard came out with their major study on the famine in 2007 and made the allegation, made the very sensible assessment that the North Korean regime's culpability in this vast misery called the North Korean famine elevates the famine to crime against humanity, most of us in this room, I think, would have concurred. But there were dissenters. I think with the COI report, very few people can put forth a vigorous counter-argument to the claim that systematic and widespread crimes have been going on in North Korea for decades, including the inhumane act of knowingly prolonging starvation. Let me try to make my case. First, I want to underscore the brutality of the Japanese colonial era, with apologies to Bruce Klingner for being repetitive. I want to repeat something I said here a few months ago. Had the United States, during the occupation of Japan, 1945 to 1952, did what Japan had in Korea, 1910 to 1945, the United States may have taken the following course of action. Impose on Japan the adoption of Christianity as the national religion of Japan. Forcibly impose on Japan the adoption of American surnames, family names. Prohibit the study and the use of Japanese language, instead insist that English be spoken in Japanese schools. Contain Japanese history under the narrative arc of US history. Forcibly take young Japanese men to America to work in harsh conditions in American mines and factories. Forcibly conscript young Japanese men to prosecute America's wars. And forcibly take young Japanese women and girls to serve in American military sexual slavery camps all over the world. We know the US did none of these things, did quite the opposite, gave generously to Japan more than $2 billion, more than the national budget during those lean years in post-1945 Japan. Far it be for me to romanticize the Japanese colonial system. It was in many ways uniquely brutal, in many ways unique. Koreans and Japanese are ethnic cousins, sharing far greater common experiences and culture than any other colonial relations. The Japanese totalitarian state was like the North Korean state in many ways, armed with the ubiquitous thought police, weapons, use of force, a powerful bureaucracy, all committed to a ruthless nationalistic purpose. But had the Kim dynasty over the past nearly 7 decades pursued Japanese policy in North Korea, they may have done the following: allow people the freedom to choose where to live, allow people the freedom to choose what school to attend, allow people to own private land, property, and other properties, allow for mixed marriages instead of killing fetuses, unborn, or newborns born of mixed couples. Allow for basic freedom of press, religion, worship, build churches and other houses of worship, although occasionally they might be harassed, although occasionally there might be some censorship. Allow for independent North Korean newspapers, as the Japanese did from 1920 to 1945, allowing for indigenous Korean newspapers and even access to foreign radio broadcast. Allow for basic freedoms, and allow the people the right to food. and to use a phrase from the UN Commission of Inquiry report, and related rights to life. When my frequent collaborator, Josh Stanton, and I point out that recent UN FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, according to latest studies on food insecurity, for example, 2013, contends that 84% of North Koreans are suffering from only, quote, poor or borderline food consumption, or according to the more recent report, the 2014 report, in terms of the percentage of people suffering from malnourishment, in terms of the worst countries where the food insecurity situation is the worst, that number one is Haiti, with 51.8% of the population suffering from malnourishment. Number two, Zambia, over 43%. And number three, in a virtual tie, you have North Korea, the Central African Republic, and Namibia at 37.5%, 37.6%, 35.3%, respectively. It has no meaning, virtually. In many ways, these are statistics that are too abstract for us to truly understand. You heard today powerful testimonials from our former North Korean friends. Testimonials that require no dramatization. But to many of us, to most of us, dramatization, even fiction, can provide an insight that hard facts cannot. And let me just quote one passage from Adam Johnson's Pulitzer-winning novel, The Orphan Master's Son. The heroine of the novel, looking at people stealing flowers from a cemetery, remarks disparagingly of that act, and the protagonist thinks to himself, what, had she never been hungry enough to eat a flower? That a person hungry enough can eat the smiling faces of violas, the dry stems of dandelions, even the bitter hips of roses. We cannot fully empathize with the suffering of the North Korean people, the majority of the North Korean people. We can understand it because we have the capacity for abstract sympathy, most of us. But we cannot fully understand what life is like in North Korea. But we know enough. We know enough not to ignore it. So what to do? What to do? We talked about sanctions. We talked about the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act a little bit in the first panel. There are many misunderstandings, misperceptions related to sanctions, especially targeted financial sanctions. Let me just say that there are at least two major precedents that strongly suggest that we can even influence China to do the right thing. Not perhaps wholeheartedly to change course, but at the same time, not to go on impeding our efforts to go after North Korea's illicit activities and crimes against humanity. The Banco Delta Asia precedent is there, when the Bank of China would refuse to touch North Korea's tainted $25 million in that small Macanese bank. And in more recent years, in the wake of North Korea's third nuclear test on February 12, 2013, when the US Treasury Department designated North Korea's major bank, the Foreign Trade Bank, as a major node in North Korea's WMD proliferation network, China's four largest banks, as Josh points out, China's four large banks cut off money transfer with that North Korean bank overnight, refused to deal with that bank. Banks are conservative, the major banks are. Smaller banks will go on dealing with North Korea. But secondary sanctions, going after third country Chinese banks and entities and individuals, imposing on them financial loss and risk, is a proven method of altering this equation where we have been supplying North Korea with unconditional aid, both food, material, cash, fertilizer, for more than 20 years, and North Korea's nuclear and long-range missile programs have advanced. We can change that equation. What has been lacking so far is the political will. Edward Gibbon, celebrated for his magisterial study on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, in speaking of the consecutive reigns of Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius, 318 to 161, 161 to 180 AD, respectively, says, perhaps this is the sole period, only period in history where the sole object of government was the happiness of a great people. You're wondering, why do I bring this up? He goes on to say, the former's reign was marked by the rare advantage of furnishing very few material for history, history which is indeed little more than the register of crimes and follies and misfortunes of mankind. I think on one level we can say that the history of the DPRK is little more than the register of follies, misfortunes, crimes of the Kim dynasty. And although, in a similar vein, we have very few material, there is paucity of reliable information with respect to North Korea, I think by now we can make the conclusion that the sole object of the combined reigns of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un has been little more than the happiness of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. And that should change. We should change that. Thank you.
Roberta?
Good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank Bruce Klingner for inviting us to Heritage, and I want to give a special thanks to Suzanne Schulte, who's the vice chair, the co-vice chair of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, and I always think of her as a sort of force of nature. And I think the North Korea Human Rights Week reflects that with great energy, passion, and tremendous dedication. I was asked to really comment on what should the U.S. government do. And I sat down in front of my computer and thought, well, what are the things I'd like to ask the U.S. government to do? I knew the sanctions issue would be covered, so I focused on other issues. And the first one that I came up with was really a plea to maintain the rhetoric. That was my first one. You've probably heard criticism that all there is rhetoric. But let me remind you that it took a long time for the United States to make human rights an essential part of its policy toward North Korea. In the days of the six-party talks, the mere mention of human rights to the State Department as an issue to raise with North Korea was rejected out of hand. At that time, attention to human rights was promised only when normalization of relations would take place. I remember being asked to send over to the State Department a copy, to the East Asian Bureau at the State Department, a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with an explanation of whether or not North Korea and other states were bound by it. The Committee for Human Rights in North Korea were actually engaged in trying to get the State Department to stop trying to tone down the Human Rights Report. Today, the Secretary of State of the United States and our Ambassador to the United Nations, our Special Envoy on Human Rights in North Korea, the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, to mention but a few, all emphasize in public the human rights issue in North Korea and in no uncertain terms. It's important to study that language and make sure it continues, and with useful content. What I don't find useful are statements about evil. What I do find useful are statements that specifically point to and call for the closure of the prison labor camps, which the U.S. is now doing. The second recommendation that I would make is that the U.S. remain consistent in paying attention to human rights in North Korea, which means that a focus is necessary even when political or nuclear talks are in preparation or ongoing. Last year, at a press conference in Seoul, President Obama said that if North Korea continues its military provocations, it's important for us to look at additional ways to apply pressure. And one of those ways, he said, was highlighting the human rights violations that make North Korea probably the worst human rights violator in the world. Well, if the president considers North Korea to be probably the worst human rights violator in the world, then human rights must be firmly grounded in U.S. policy as a goal of its own. It cannot be a weapon to turn off and on in response to North Korea's military provocations. Samantha Power's formulation was a good one at the Security Council when she said that the international community does not need to choose between focusing on North Korea's proliferation of nuclear weapons and focusing on its widespread and ongoing abuses against its own people. We must do both, and so must the United States. Both objectives need to be pursued. Am I speaking too quickly? I see there's translation here.
I want to make sure you guys knew that they're
Translating.
They're not talking over you. They're trying to make sure you get
Okay.
everything you're saying.
Okay. Hold a hand if I go too quickly. Okay. Third, at the United Nations, the United States must help to build the foundation for maintaining North Korea's human rights situation on the Security Council agenda by keeping a spotlight on the issue. Now, that means arranging briefings at the Council by the High Commissioner for Human Rights or others. Briefings may require votes, at least 9, if there's opposition. And the U.S., together with other states, should help mobilize those votes. Keeping the human rights situation on the agenda of the Security Council will reinforce the linkage that was established last year between the nature of the regime, that is, its deplorable human rights record, and international peace and security. And it will hold over North Korea's head the threat of accountability. Some recommend that the U.S. go for broke and press for immediate Security Council referral of the North Korea case to the International Criminal Court. This will let everyone see that China and Russia are casting vetoes. But in my opinion, this would work only if the vast majority of the Council supported referral to the court. Right now, that's not the case. The composition of the Council has changed since last December when North Korea's human rights situation was placed on the agenda. However, the items being on the agenda is a great disturbance for North Korea's leadership. The mere idea that North Korea's leaders, in particular Kim Jong-un, who is struggling to consolidate his power and legitimacy, could be brought before an international court for crimes against humanity has rattled the leadership and has aroused an array of conflicting responses from Pyongyang's government, from bellicose rhetoric to military threats to sudden participation in dialogue, to invitations to human rights bodies to visit, to the withdrawal of those invitations. So having the item kept on the Security Council agenda carries some leverage. NGOs would do well to send information to the International Criminal Court, which the NGOs can publicize, even though the prosecutor cannot now address the situation. The information being filed there, with more and more information coming forward, might be a step that helps erode the deification of the regime and even sow some doubts among the elites. Fourth, to reinforce this, the U.S. should begin to bring forward the names of camp commanders and other mid-level officials directly involved in the commission of atrocities. The threat of indictment is powerful. It might even have some deterrent effect. Some South Korean experts have reported anecdotal evidence that commanders in some detention centers have modified some of their practices because of fear of possible future prosecution. Calls by states in the Security Council for targeted sanctions against the individuals most responsible for crimes against humanity would also be useful as recommended in the COI report. This too could instill a little fear and chip away at the regime's legitimacy, and at the national level, the U.S. should begin to add names of persons and entities engaged in serious human rights violations to the sanctions list under the President's new executive order of January 2015. This order authorizes sanctions, including against those committing serious human rights violations in North Korea. It's the first time we have such an executive order. Fifth, at the United Nations, the United States must expand its focus beyond the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and the Security Council to encompass the entire UN system. There are a myriad of UN offices and agencies, whether on refugees, health, food and development, women's empowerment, child protection, business training, that are involved with North Korea. They need to incorporate human rights concerns into their work in accordance with a new policy that's been introduced at the UN in 2013 by the Secretary General, which is called the Human Rights Up Front approach, or RUF, the acronym. It calls upon the entire UN system, when faced with severe violations of human rights, to develop a system-wide strategy. That means that agencies like the World Food Program, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, UNHCR, the Refugee Agency, and the UN Development Program consider how to promote human rights in their work. Let me give an example or two. The COI report has pointed out that North Korea's Seong-min system, or the social caste system, based on political loyalty, interferes with access to health care for persons not favored by the regime. Shouldn't the WHO and UNICEF examine this finding and begin to look for ways to raise and address it, especially since North Korea says it wants to increase access to health care, so it says at the United Nations? Or what about the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP? They train North Koreans in business management and law. Shouldn't it make sure that North Korea sends to the training not only men, but also women, and emphasizes the importance of the internet for business practices? And what about tuberculosis, a major problem in North Korea, where there's also a large prison population? WHO has found in other countries that effective TB control in prison protects the community at large. Shouldn't WHO seek to apply its Health in Prison program to North Korea? And shouldn't WFP be trying to address discriminatory food policies and encourage agricultural reforms? As a major donor to many of these agencies, the United States and other major donors need to express support for these organizations applying the rights upfront approach to North Korea. 6, the U.S. must develop a list of priorities for negotiating with North Korea in the human rights area. Sometimes it's argued that the U.S., United States, should only raise with North Korea those human rights issues that North Korea has expressed willingness to talk about. That is the human rights recommendations that North Korea accepted last year in a UN process called the Universal Periodic Review. These recommendations are important. They focus primarily on improving the right to food and health care, education, and advancing women's and children's rights, but more is needed. North Korea, of its own accord, has ratified 4 human rights treaties, including one on civil and political rights. So on the table must also be protection from cruel and inhuman treatment and public executions, torture, the release of political prisoners, and freedom of movement, expression, and religion. The COI report documented a wide array of crimes against humanity and persecution that cannot be ignored because North Korea prefers sidestepping these issues. Let me mention that the other day I noticed that one of the organizers of the May 24 Women's Peace March said, when asked whether she would raise human rights issues, that it would be counterproductive. You don't raise bad things, she said, on a first date. But these bad things are already widely known. They don't have to be revealed by one of the parties on the date. The train left the station with the COI report. And frankly, the North Koreans probably expect these issues to be raised. As Samantha Power told the Security Council, silence will not make the North Korean government end its abuses. Finally, the U.S. should admit more North Koreans to this country and help North Koreans who fled to other countries with scholarships. To date, only some 171 North Koreans have been admitted here, which President George W. Bush called a paltry sum. Far more attention needs to be paid to helping those who escaped the country to gain entry to the United States if they wish to come here. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much to Bruce and Heritage for hosting this fabulous event, and to Suzanne Schulte for all of her leadership over many years, especially on North Korea Freedom Week. It's great to be here with Roberta and Seong-min and so many other friends who, unfortunately, I see at these events over and over and over again. Not that I don't love your company, but I'd rather be talking about progress being made than being here talking about the same issues. I'm going to take a slightly different take on the discussion for this afternoon, which is to review, on the one hand, how far we've come, actually, in the last 15 years in talking about the situation in North Korea, and also how dramatically far we have to go. And I think we know the latter quite well, but I think it's worth dwelling for a moment on the former. So I'm an international human rights lawyer. I suppose, as one would say, if you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail. So as a human rights lawyer, I think that the law can actually be a useful tool, even in the case of a North Korea, to understand what is happening there. If we look back 15 years, we only had the first defectors coming out of North Korea, refugees coming out of North Korea, and finding themselves in Seoul. Back in the year 2000, there were, 100 or less. Today we have 25, 30,000 or more. And back then, we knew that things were terrible in North Korea, but we didn't have the data or the information or the stories to be able to explain how bad things really were in North Korea, which was the hermit kingdom that nobody could enter or exit. And so human rights groups began their hard work documenting the stories of the defectors who were talking about what was going on in the country. And human rights groups began to produce the first reports in the early 2000s, Hidden Gulag being among the first. And we saw a range of reports on the food issue, on abductions, on political prison camps coming out. In 2006, I got first recruited to the cause as a human rights lawyer pro bono and was asked to represent Václav Havel, Elie Wiesel, and the former Prime Minister of Norway, Kjell Magne Bondevik, to work with the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea in producing a report called Failure to Protect. That report didn't do any original reporting on the actual human rights abuses in North Korea, but rather applied a new legal framework to the situation, which was to look at the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, the duty of all states to prevent mass atrocity crimes, which had been adopted by the General Assembly in 2005, and apply that to the situation in North Korea, doing what was then the first analysis of the situation in North Korea constituting crimes against humanity under international law. And we, in fact, back in 2006, asked for the Security Council to engage on the situation in North Korea because of our assessment at the time as to what had been happening. Subsequently, there were a range of other reports that reaffirmed the assessment that what was happening in North Korea was crimes against humanity. In 2012, there was a coalition created, the Coalition to Stop Crimes Against Humanity in North Korea, of which many of your organizations are members, that came together to advocate for the creation of a commission of inquiry into North Korean mass atrocity crimes. I was honored to serve as pro bono counsel to that coalition and to work with the coalition members to successfully persuade the United Nations in 2013, the Human Rights Council, to create the commission of inquiry into North Korean mass atrocity crimes. That led to, of course, the appointment of Justice Kirby and his colleagues, and Justice Kirby and his colleagues deserve immense credit, especially Justice Kirby, for the extraordinary work that they did, taking a mechanism of a commission of inquiry and transforming it into much more than merely a documentation process, but creating a dialogue with the international community about what was really happening and hearing from victims both in public hearings around the world, but also in private as necessary, and experts to then process all of the information that had been received and garnered over such a very long period of time. Now with 25, 30,000 defectors having come out and told their stories, and so many others interviewed in China about what was really going on. And of course, the commission concluded, as we did back in 2006, some, sadly, 8 years later, that what was going on in North Korea was in fact crimes against humanity, that the responsibility to protect had been violated, and that the international community was compelled to action. This led, of course, the Human Rights Council to accept the report, to request the referral to the International Criminal Court. It led the General Assembly to follow up and endorse the report, and ultimately to the Security Council to put it on its permanent agenda this past December. So that's where we've come from in 15 years. And sadly, although I don't believe this has had a great impact on the life of the average North Korean person, in terms of engaging the international community, we have come actually a very long way from where people were unable to speak with any authority about what was actually happening in North Korea to not only understanding it, processing it, and then analyzing it and explaining what was really going on. And knowledge to me of what is happening is a prerequisite to persuading people to take action. And so despite how horrible things are, one has to go through the process of documentation in order to persuade people to take action, particularly in a country as closed as North Korea. So in 2015, we're on the Council agenda, and where do we go from here? And that is, of course, the only question that matters. To my mind, I would like 2015 to be the year of actually helping North Koreans on the ground in North Korea, not merely North Koreans in China or North Koreans who escape to Seoul. So there are a number of things that I would say about what we need to do from here. First, with respect to the UN Security Council, I can't overstate the importance that North Korea is on the Council agenda. And I say this from some experience, I would note, working on the situation of Burma over many, many years, where I was part of a group advocating to place Burma on the Council agenda. And we had many circumstances, even after a veto from China and Russia, where Burma was discussed over many, many years. And at one moment in time after the Saffron Revolution, even China and Russia had to stand back and allow a presidential statement to be adopted, which laid out a framework for the kind of change that needed to happen in Burma. Burma still has a very long way to go, but it is in a dramatically different place than it was back then. I said that because North Korea cannot be taken off the Council agenda unless there's an affirmative vote of 9 member states to do so, and that will not happen. And what that means is that there will be regular reporting from the UN and from various UN agencies and experts as to what is happening in North Korea with respect to human rights on a going forward basis. And each of those moments in time presents an opportunity for those briefing the Council to then speak to the media, and for those of us in civil society to also be talking about what's going on there. I don't think it's enough to just have conversations in the Council, however. And it seems to me, unless China especially sees a meaningful threat of action in the Council, and by that I mean a proposed Security Council resolution, then they will not have any incentive to actually press North Korea to make some concessions on the issues that we all care about and would like to see happen. Open access for humanitarian aid, access to the prison camps for the ICRC. I'm just starting with very modest requests. I have many more aggressive ones as well. But I do believe that we need to keep on the table going to a vote on a Security Council resolution. Whether we go there or not, I think has to be kept as an open question. But without making clear that the US, the UK, France, and other like-minded countries are not prepared to do that, then the meaning of being on the Council agenda will be lost. I would also say that it is always a balancing act between, in all of these kinds of mass atrocity situations, between seeking justice and accountability on the one hand, and seeking the amelioration of the suffering of victims today that are currently suffering in that country. And this is something I think that we have to struggle with in terms of pursuing at the same time. Clearly, we need justice and accountability, but if you're an average North Korean starving in North Korea, you need food. And one has to look at the kind of trade-offs that one has to make in order to provide a way forward to try to do both of these things over time. And it is a very, very tough challenge. I also would reaffirm what Roberta said about the need to engage the broad range of UN agencies in engaging inside North Korea. There have been heavy limits placed on UN agencies, the World Food Program, UNICEF, and others in working in the country. My view is that we can talk to China and we need to appeal to China in regards to their own best interests when it comes to these humanitarian issues. As we all know, there's an 880-mile porous border between China and North Korea. During the 1990s famine, the late 1990s famine, hundreds of thousands of people streamed out of the country, and North Korea always appears to be on the verge of another famine. In the 21st century, as compared to the 20th century, while North Korea remains very hard to penetrate, China is very easy to penetrate, and information is very easy to get out of China. And the last thing that the Chinese government should want would be for another major famine to hit North Korea and hundreds of thousands of people flowing into China. It's my view that we can appeal to China's self-interest with respect to feeding the people of North Korea. As many also know, the Seong-min system and the way that food is provided in the country, in North Korea, radiates outward from Pyongyang, and the border between North Korea and China is quite a distance from Pyongyang. It turns out that the people on the other side of the border are not very well fed by the North Korean government. And surely if I were the Chinese government, I should want the people right on the other side of the border who might come searching for food to be well fed. And so therefore, it would seem to me that we should be able to press the Chinese government to push the North Koreans to allow open access for humanitarian aid as a mere starting point in a self-interested set of actions by China to try to help themselves while at the same time being able to benefit the North Korean people. There are also other actions that can be taken by UN agencies to cooperate with North Korea. I'm aware, for example, that there have been international organizations that have been able to actually cooperate with North Korea on vaccinations, on health issues, and other kinds of less visible but productive things. And we need to explore the range of ways that we can look to ameliorate the suffering of the North Korean people to the extent that that is possible. We all ultimately know that this government is the problem here. And I think Samantha Power's comment about how silence will not end the suffering of the North Korean people is important to recall. In addition, it's also worth noting the need to continue the documentation process of what is happening in North Korea, not merely for the sake of doing so or for the sake of history, but for the sake of justice and accountability. North Korea is actually already on the International Criminal Court's agenda with respect to the sinking of the Jeong-hun and the Yeonpyeong Island shelling. I don't expect the court to have much information on which to render indictments in those cases potentially anytime in the near future because information is so hard to come by. But we do need to be hearing the stories, particularly of defectors coming out, documenting what's going on, connecting the dots between the different crimes that are being committed, and making those into a permanent record that will be available for potential prosecution in the future. And the North Koreans need to know, and especially the mid-level commanders need to know, that that documentation process is ongoing and that the possibility of justice is not too far in the distant future. To that end, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is seeking to open an office in Seoul to be able to continue the work of the Commission of Inquiry indirectly in terms of documenting human rights abuses of North Koreans that are coming out in the form of defectors and interview of defectors as well. And the government of South Korea needs to accept the placement of the office there and needs to cooperate with the international community to enable that documentation process to proceed. Let me just conclude by saying the following. There are no easy answers or simple solutions to address the suffering of the North Korean people. All of us know that well. I was once asked by a friend who I've known for many years, why do I bother working on North Korea? It's so impossible. And on the one hand, to me, that comes across as both a silly question and yet a very profound question as well. And my response to my friend was to say that, you know, this is quite different than at the time where many people in World War II didn't know what was happening in Auschwitz. Many people, by the way, did, actually, and chose to do nothing, but many people didn't know. Here, the international community knows clearly and unequivocally exactly what is happening. And we know if we do nothing exactly what the outcome will be. More suffering, more intense violations of human rights, and a stain on our collective conscience as humanity, standing idly by while good people suffer so incredibly horrifically in the 21st century in which there is so much plenty and so much possibility to improve people's lives. And so my answer to my friend of why I do this is because how could I not do this? How could we stand silently by while people suffer where we know they are suffering, where we know they are suffering intensely, and not do everything possible to try to have an impact? So there are no easy solutions, but as Margaret Mead, the American sociologist, said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And all of us, I think, have no choice by virtue of the suffering and its profound scale to continue to do everything humanly possible to continue to struggle until North Korea is one day free, until, in the meantime, along that path, the North Korean people are provided as much aid as we can get into the country, and ultimately, until justice and accountability can be visited upon the perpetrators of these horrific crimes. Thank you.
Those are three outstanding presentations looking at the same issue in three very different venues, so I appreciate all of them. Since I know Roberta has to leave right at 5, if I could ask a question or two. before we throw it open to the floor, is you said we should expand the sort of the UN focus beyond the immediate agencies that have been involved. And that raises to me the idea of the World Food Program and the UNDP. Should we pull them out? Should we not allow the UN to engage with them, providing benefits while they're in violation not only of the COI report, but all the UN resolutions against their nuke and missile programs? And the second question is, when you said we should bring forward names of camp commanders and other violators, the U.S. has identified by name rulers of other countries. I believe the presidents of Belarus and Zimbabwe or Congo, but we have no names so far of any North Korean human rights violators. Should we identify Kim Jong-un by name? So if I could offer those questions, and then we'll turn to the audience.
The question about the agencies, the policy that the Secretary General introduced in 2013 is new. It's just getting underway now. It's at the UN and probably elsewhere. You introduce a policy and nothing happens for a long time, and then it begins to, there begin to be meetings about it. So we're now in 2015, and the application of this policy is beginning to be looked at, and also to North Korea, because they are implementing it with regard to a number of countries. North Korea, I say we because it's NGOs and other experts, there's a bit of prodding that we do, and a bit of meeting with people at the UN to get them to look at this. And I don't usually like to make a commercial, but I have an article in 38 North last week which kind of goes into some of the details for those of you who are interested. The agencies are beginning to, I think they're reading the COI report. That's a beginning. And we certainly—
That does take a little time.
That takes a little time. It's 400 pages. But what was interesting is that the COI report did deal with food. Everyone assumed it would deal with the issues that were expected of prison camps and executions, et cetera, torture. But it devotes a lot of attention to food and to policies that lead to mass starvation. This has, I think, rattled a bit the agencies because on food and also on health care, but food got a particular hit. I think it's important for these agencies to begin to come together, and they are, to talk about what is it we can do, and to get the Deputy Secretary General of the UN in charge of this rights up front approach, to begin to push them, what it is you can do to begin to incorporate human rights in your work. And I suppose one of the questions that you're raising, Bruce, is at what point do agencies leave the country? At what point, when they have no cooperation, do you exit, or should you be encouraged to exit? I think right now the United States, which is a major donor, as I mentioned when I was speaking of some of these agencies, ought to make it known that it's important to the donors for the agencies to do something. In fact, one of the agency people, I won't mention which agency, said to me, if the donors want it, we'll look at it. If the donors say they want this, and I think they should, then it's time for these agencies to begin to look at the different ways that the COI report and the findings could fit into what it is they do on the ground. And there is plenty they can do and work out. And there are some meetings developing, and I'm going to keep hammering on this point and looking at it and writing about it. With regard to the names of the camp commanders, if you're asking, well, should we just get up and announce that Kim Jong-un should be on the list and should go to a court? I don't think politically this is realistic. It's not just political will, but I think that it would be very important in my mind that you begin to rattle the elites in the country, and you begin to rattle those who are engaged in atrocities. And if names can be found and brought forward, not in one long list, but just maybe one at a time, of people that are known to be involved in the prison camps, for example, and who are involved in committing atrocities in detention centers, and who's in charge of this. This will begin to, I think, begin to be a little bit of an earthquake in terms of the fear that these people could be held accountable. So I'm in favor of starting with names, adding them on this list I mentioned of the President's executive order. I don't think they're there yet, but identifying people. It's not that easy with such a secretive country to just name the names, but I think there are names that can be gotten, and I think these should begin to be little by little brought out. I think it will rattle the regime. I think it should go after them. Eventually, I mean, and I think that's known, that if you begin to name these names little by little, Kim Jong-un and company begin to realize we're the ones that it's going to come to us. And that's what I think has so disturbed them enough to suddenly begin to have an array of responses that never existed before at the UN. They are rattled by this.
Right, thank you. So we'll open the floor, sir.
Great sources of names. One is the North Korea database, which debriefs people who have gotten out of the country, actually names the people that tortured them. That's a great source of names. And our intelligence agencies have the whole order of battle. I think it would be a major important campaign for all of us to pressure the NSC to declassify those names without risking methods and sources to the advantage of the entire enterprise. I don't think that's too big a gift for CIA and NSA to give to us.
Say something. I agree. I think that the important part about how to do this is not just putting a bunch of North Korean names on a list, which to most people their eyes will glaze over, but explaining, you know, this person is the commander of camp, whatever, and to then also for those victims who are willing to speak out, because there are some who have, many who have actually, to start to tell the stories of what happens in these places and connect it to that person. So to bring to life the individual stories that are being represented in the sanctions that are being imposed. And I think across the board, not just on North Korea where it hasn't even happened yet, but in most cases, sadly, you mostly just see the U.S. putting a whole bunch of names on the SDN list, on the specially designated national list, with very little explanation as to why they're actually there. And I think that particularly in North Korea, where the challenge is about getting traction with the international community and a sense of urgency for action, we need a lot more than an ordinary sanctions process here in order to, and to squeeze out every drop of value from who gets put on that list.
When the COI was doing all its interviews, beyond what was published in the document, would they have been collecting names? I mean, either by purpose or just as the witnesses were saying, I was at this camp, you know, Sergeant Kim was my torturer. Would they have already been generating that information? It's
my understanding that they have they've taken names and put them in a private archive at the UN. But then I heard that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, the report itself names institutions throughout, but probably they have some names because there were a lot of testimony that was given in private. And so from the UN, if the UN would open its archive, if they have some names, and give them to the U.S., that would be useful too.
I would just give an example of this, and it's about declassifying across the board on this stuff, but particularly what's happening right now. The day that I happened to testify before the commission here in Washington about the application of the responsibility to protect to the situation there, one of the witnesses who got up and spoke, I don't remember his name, but was the son of a Korean War veteran who was in a prison camp at the end of the war and who disappeared. And he has for decades been trying to find out what happened to his father, because there was an exchange of prisoner lists going in both directions between North Korea and a range of the different powers. And if your name was on the list on both sides, you were exchanged and you got out. But there were a number of U.S. servicemen at the time who said, well, I saw so-and-so, he was with me, where is he? Why didn't he come out? And all of that stuff was really suppressed, and there's tons of information in UN archives, tons of information as well on those kinds of questions. This is just one small piece of it. But my view is that neither the United Nations nor the Commission of Inquiry nor the United States should be complicit in covering up who the perpetrators are. And if the victims want to have their stories told publicly, they should be given the opportunity to do so. But particularly with respect to the perpetrators, I think, you know, nobody should be covering up who the perpetrators are. Obviously, you have to vet information for accuracy and everything else, and that's a fair point. But
Let me just add one point, though. I think some of the information is kept very private because of the need to protect witnesses and protect families in North Korea. I don't think I've ever met a North Korean who isn't aware and a bit frightened about family members and colleagues and friends who left behind, and how even a name of someone might reveal who, what, where. So I think I remember Justice Kirby talking about having to respect that.
well, there are very few similarities, and some, but there are some. I mean, clearly you've got military governments in both places with a very strong hand, unlike Burma, which always has had a democratic opposition that was doing the best it could under difficult circumstances. You've never had anything close to that that anyone's aware of in North Korea. I do think that what one learns from the change in Burma, which is quite interesting, I think, is when you talk to senior government officials there, which, I mean, I was on the blacklist for 6 years in Burma. I'm now not only off it, and I'm able to meet with Burmese government officials. The primary driver was really, for them deciding to open, was actually the indirect effect of sanctions. And by that, what I mean is U.S. and Western sanctions drove the country deeper into the pockets of China, and that was a very unpleasant place to be when you're talking about the kind of investments that China was making in Burma and running roughshod over local people. And you happen to have a guy in Thein Sein who saw that firsthand and saw the corruption of his predecessor, Choi, being paid off by the Chinese to set up these projects, who decided that he had to choose between being a patriot or selling out his country to China entirely and being a permanent colony. And in his case, he decided to go in a different direction because he wanted to maintain his grip on power, no doubt, but also not see his country be entirely controlled by China into the foreseeable future. And I think what you are going to need, much like with Burma, is a change of leadership of some kind, where there are people who decide that they, you know, want a managed authoritarian regime rather than a, you know, totalitarian regime. I think the government of Burma saw it as in its interest for its own people in certain respects, and frankly for reducing international pressure to open up. Of course, that also gives us a much bigger foothold to do much more in Burma, which is what I think all of us who have been following the situation there are pushing for and hoping for, and they still have a very, very long way to go. But I think at the end of the day, you know, North Korea is quite a different story than Burma. But I do think that there are some lessons for how to push North Korea as much as possible, and I think there's hope, as Roberta said, from their reaction to the COI. You know, if they didn't care, if they were impervious to criticism, then they would act like China, which these days, unfortunately, is very powerful, and the U.S., the U.K., France are hesitant to even raise human rights issues with the Chinese for fear of upsetting them. If you want to see what a real great power does when criticized on human rights and they don't like it, they're just silent. They don't have any need to do anything at all. And I think that the North Koreans are hypersensitive, and their reactions only prove that we need to keep doing exactly what we're doing because we are having an impact in our work. And, you know, the wall will crack and will break one day. It's just a matter of continuing the pressure.
I think we'll take another question.
예, 북한에서 온 탈북민이고요. 저희 부모님은 납북자로 전쟁 6.25 때 북한에 끌려갔었고 또 그 이후로 남한 출신이라는 가족으로 인해 가지고 저희가 항상 북한에서 감시 대상이 되었고 그 이후로 저희 오빠가 94년도 김일성이 죽었을 때 북한에 밀수 갔다가 거기서 잡혀가지고 160년 길을 트럭에 끌려서 그 이후에 정치범 수용소에 갔는데 작년에 저희가 유엔 청문회에서 증언까지 했었는데 그 증언을 해가지고 북한에서는 정치범 수용소라는 거 없다 이렇게 인정을 하고 있는데 유엔에서는 어떤 이런 것을 어떻게 끝까지 해결할 것인지 여기에 대해서 궁금한데요.
So she'd like to share her story. Actually, their parents were abducted during the Korean War, and they're brought to North Korea during the Korean War. And actually, her brother is also sent to the political prison camp because he was caught in smuggling in 1994. And last year, actually, she testified in front of the UN talking about the political prison camp, but North Korean government regime has been denying the existence of a political prison camp. So is there any way that international society or UN can solve this issue?
As you know very well, for many years, most people in South Korea, in the government, and in society at large, also argued that political prisoner concentration camps in North Korea did not exist because we couldn't verify their existence. I think that kind of denial and willful ignorance has turned a corner, especially in the aftermath of the UN COI report. I think the trend, not only at the UN, but also in some branches of the US government, including Congress, in recent years is an irresistible trend, which is more and more emphasis on addressing the serious conditions of life in North Korea, including the existence of the concentration camps. The North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act of 2015 addresses these issues, not just making a symbolic stance by calling for a list of names of perpetrators, but, for example, Section 301 requires the United States President to submit a feasible plan for the provision of inexpensive cellular and internet communications to the people of North Korea so as to crack at the information blockade that the regime wages against its own people. It will take time, but I think the view that human rights only impedes negotiations on the nuclear issue or arms reduction, I think that misguided view is slowly changing. So I think there is some hope. I've never been able to understand, looking at the past 20 years of unremitting failure of nuclear negotiations, why the US president, or especially the South Korean president, would not come out and make the basic decent demand on the North Korean regime to tear down the concentration camps. The first official of prominence to do that was John Kerry last year, and I give him credit. I think making basic demands on the regime at every chance to dismantle the concentration camps, to eliminate the insidious political class system of Seong-min, to feed the people, to stop seizing the crops, the food, to allow for market, allow for basic freedoms, internal movement, let the people get out of there if they want to. I think making such reasonable demands, it's incumbent on donor nations, on the world's biggest countries, and NGOs also, to exercise their moral but also material leverage to make those basic demands, call on North Korea to abide by universal code of conduct, allow for some measure of transparency when it comes to monitoring. Why are we so risk averse? Why do we continue to think that if we bring these issues up, North Korea will bristle and maybe attack South Korea, when the past 6 decades of North Korea's history is that it chooses to attack, launch limited, sometimes deadly, but limited attacks at a time of its own strategic choice? So I think if we are aliens looking at the situation in the Korean Peninsula over the past 6 decades, I think the alien observer would be dumbfounded to see how such a poor, small country, when measured by the conventional indices of measuring state power, economic power, population, territorial size, political power, soft power, when it is so meager, so weak compared to South Korea and all other regional powers, how such a country has managed to outmaneuver the world's biggest countries, bullying, extorting, deceiving these countries into giving it virtually unconditional aid in excess of tens of billions of dollars over the past 20 years, I think that is a really an anomalous, to be polite, record. And it's time that we recognize the folly of continuing down that path.
I would just note as a quick amendment to what you just said, anomalous and yet inspiring of countries like Iran in their own pursuit of nuclear weapons, because if I'm the government of Iran looking at North Korea and I see how they were able to persuade the international community to enter into these series of deals and all the while pursuing their nuclear weapons, at the end of the day, you know, they see the difference between North Korea, which has not had its dictatorship toppled, versus Iraq, you know, Tunisia, Libya, et cetera, which did not have nuclear weapons and ultimately did not survive. So I think that it's a major challenge to deal with. And I think that, I think the last point I would make, as we're coming to a close, I'm sure, is to reinforce the value of law here, not just because I'm a hammer and everything I see is a nail, but also because what's interesting is in the 20th century, the challenge was getting people to agree to universal human rights norms and standards. We had the Universal Declaration in 1948 and a series of other international treaties that most countries in the world have signed on to. Today, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has about 170 states parties covering about 92% of the world's population. So while people may argue cultural relativism or that there are different Asian values versus Western values, there's actually only a single interpretation under that treaty for what is freedom of opinion and expression. Now, why this matters in the case of North Korea is because they've signed actually every human rights treaty out there and agreed that they would be bound by those treaties. And that also provides a means of engaging with the North Koreans who insist, interestingly enough, they don't say we're violating human rights and we're proud of it. They either claim that the violations don't exist or that they're scrupulously abiding by their obligations under international law. And so that does provide a launching point for an engagement and conversations with them, in my view, to be able to discuss these issues, you know, about what international standards are for the right to food and whether or not they're meeting those obligations, for example.
Well, in the interest of being fair to my panelists and bringing this to an end somewhat close to on time, I have to be unfair to our audience and preclude any more questions from being asked. But I think just in conclusion, I'm reminded of the famous quote by Edmund Burke of, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing." So certainly the Commission of Inquiry report and all other efforts in some small way, what we've done here today as well, to try to bring knowledge and advocacy for doing the right thing in North Korea to try to overcome the situation that's going there. So please join me in thanking my panelists here, as well as Suzanne and others.